This video will be on the history of hunting rounds and military firearms and bullets. Smokeless powder was adopted by militaries, a lot of them, by 1890 through 1900. Before that, you wanted to use a round nose bullet. You were using black powder, which had a lot of waste material in it. It required a lot more space in the cartridge than the newer smokeless powders that were coming out. And you didn't have a reason to use a pointed bullet. You wanted as much mass hitting as possible on impact. And there were certain mechanical limits because gunpowder would fire a bullet only up to a certain speed. The aerodynamics of the bullet being round-nosed allowed you to put a little more weight towards the front. Then smokeless powder came out. Now, gunpowder has a set of really weird restrictions, like don't leave any empty space in the cartridge if possible. Pack it with something else if you have to. Reduce the size of the cartridge or make it bigger. It takes up more space than smokeless powder, but it has an upper speed limit. Smokeless powder, you can put a bullet out at almost any speed you want to get away with. Some crazy speeds. Now, if you're not aware of the energy foot-pounds at muzzle or muzzle energy equation, at the muzzle, the speed of the bullet has more of an effect on its energy that it can deliver to a target than the weight. Now, if you started with a 30 caliber bullet and it weighed, let's say, 2 units, and you wanted it to have more effect, let's say you wanted to make it double, you'd have to make it 4 units, which means instead of the bullet being, let's say, this long, you had to make it twice as long to double the energy, because it's the same bore diameter. Or you had to increase the bore diameter going from one caliber to another by going up, if you're not aware of it, around 0.2, let's say 20% bigger in diameter or something crazy, something simple like that. Now, if a firearm, however, was using smokeless powder, all you had to do is just run the damn bullet faster to give it more energy foot-pounds on impact. The added benefit of this is that if it got there faster, it dropped less. So you'd have a flat trajectory. You could aim easier. Now, this brought up something really strange. You could use iron sights, simple, dumb pieces of metal attached to the top of the gun, to aim for a lot longer range. Okay, so they kind of overdid it with the 30-06, 30 caliber 1906 30-06 cartridge. Let's use a Ballistic Tip Nosler bullet example. And I'm using it at hand loading ratings. That's my excuse for combining together the maximum speed, foot-pounds, and masses. These are not going to work out if you do the foot-pound equation. But the 30-06 cartridge would do almost 3,000 feet per second, had over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy on impact, and could throw a 200-grain bullet. 200 grains, it's the unit of weight. Now, this thing had an effective range of 1,200 yards. That works out to 3,600 feet. Over a mile away, you could shoot and accurately hit a target, man-sized target, and engage that target. Now, there's a problem with this. Effective range on impact. Plenty of energy foot-pounds at muzzle. But at impact range, this was the effective range for hitting and either wounding or taking out an opponent. You can hide behind sandbags. Some trees would stop it at that range. And because of that, whoever you were shooting at would just take cover and shoot from behind cover. This became a waste of energy and materials. And also, after 1900, battles weren't fought the same way they were before. They were fought in cities. They were fought in towns. They were fought in rough terrain, not open, flat areas. We weren't doing, whip out a sword and do cavalry charges as much anymore. And what happened is people started using asymmetric warfare by using literally slingshots, bows and arrows, and pistols at shorter range and engaging you at much shorter range than you would be maybe have the gun sighted for. So a decision was made by, well, it took them this long, 1960s and 1970s. We need to use shorter ranges. Instead of 1,200 yards, let's do 600. Instead of doing 30 caliber, since we can just use smokeless powder, just like they did for the 30 caliber, I mean, we can just go ahead and use 20 caliber. Any attempt to improve things beyond a certain point meets diminishing returns, so they decided on these characteristics. 22 caliber. It needs to stay supersonic only at 500 yards. So we can really reduce the amount of propellant, the weight of the bullet, how big the cartridge is, how heavy it is, make it to where for the same amount of weight you could carry a smaller gun, more ammunition. We can keep the ammunition more consistent, so you can just set the sights once and always be able to hit. And this would still work out beyond, let's say, 500 to 600 yards. You could hit something at 1,000 yards anyway, but the hit probability wasn't required. Penetrating a steel helmet that had a 3.4 millimeter thickness, let's say. Wounding ability and ballistics and accuracy equal to the 30-06 within 500 yards because that's all they needed, or 600 yards. And 22 caliber because that meant to where you reduce the mass of the bullet and the mass of the cartridge by the same ratio. You might not get how much that is. And also you can make the bullet shorter because you didn't need to make them spaghetti long. And you just drove them to obscenely high speeds. Well, okay, let's compare them. Now, this is going to be for the 30-06 again, 3,000 foot-pounds, 3,000 feet per second, 200 grain. Okay, what did they do for the 223 5.56? Here's the 223. 3,750 feet per second, 77 grain projectile. Instead of it running effectively, almost 3,000 feet per second, this is going much faster. Instead of at 200 grain, it's 77 grain. And the average one in 5.56 is around 55 grain, but 63 grain is the highest one listed on Wikipedia. The foot-pounds energy, instead of being like 3,000 foot-pounds or more, these were hitting at 1,300 to 1,400 foot-pounds of energy. Because they didn't need more than that, because they would retain a lot of that within 500 yards. It was enough to do the job. It would poke through a helmet. It would take out your opponent. It matched the 30-06, but required much less weight, much less handling. You could make the system simpler, and because it was based on a cartridge that wasn't a revamp of something that used to be basically a black powder cartridge and then overdriving the design, this was designed with smaller bore, which meant you could use really thick barrels, weigh almost the same, and you could use more PSI rating. 5.56 NATO are given a much more narrow range. 63 grains down to 55 grains is pretty typical, which means you could sight them in really precisely and work with whatever ammunition you had as long as it was listed NATO. 223, 77 grain all the way down to 55 grain again. If you're not aware of it, your average rimfire 22 short can be loaded with a 55 grain projectile. It's a very different cartridge. Much different. It's not going 3,750 feet per second like a 223 is. There's a lot more variation in 223. And the 223 and the 5.56 were both designed for military firearms originally. Some cartridges start off military, some of them start off sporting usage and then get repurposed. This is kind of a back and forth, and mostly at the same time, because at the time this was done in the 1960s and 70s, these firearms would then be sold with civilian versions that were made nicer looking because people liked their wood grain and such. But there you are. And again, the Springfield 30-06, again, listing it again, 3,000 foot-pounds, 3,000 feet per second almost, and 200 grain projectile. Now, some people might bring up the NATO 7.62. That's also a 30 caliber. The cartridge, in this case, is a different length, but they're almost the same as the 30-06. They're not identical. It's not the same chambering. Obviously, can't interchange them. But they're comparable. And it has 2,600 foot-pounds, 175 grains, and 2,800 feet per second compared to a 30-06. It's very comparable. The NATO 7.62 was slightly smaller cartridge, slightly smaller everything, a few characteristics different, but the energy foot-pounds was even lower. And it still had a 500-yard range instead of a 600-yard range like 223 5.56 has. So that's the history of these things. By switching to these other cartridges, the idea is even with the 30 caliber, reducing the weight, making it to where you can carry more shots, and not worrying about a range beyond 500 to 600 yards. You could still shoot out to 1,200 yards, and don't get me wrong, and people buy AR-15s or other guns that do 223 or 5.56, or the 30-06 and 7.62, and go out to 1,200 yards all the time. But the point is, in the military, it didn't need to do more than a certain range. So in the military, they keep them more standardized, more narrow range, set them and forget them on the sights, and then you can put on an optic for doing longer range if you happen to get one that was good or the design was better. And again, this is for guns done assembly line style for war, no frills, and ugly looking, like an AR. Now let's get to this. Any lightweight semi-automatic rifle that's based on the Colt AR-15 design, or kind of based on the Armalite AR-15, which is actually very different. That itself was based on the Armalite AR-10, but scaled down. Both of those came out in 1957, and the Colt AR-15, let's say, later. 500 to 600 yard range guns. And again, the Remington 223 came out in 1962. 1970's was 5.56 standardization. The Springfield 30-06 came out in 1906. And the 1950s produced the NATO 7.62 cartridge. So, someone said about a murderer who shot up a bunch of people at a 4th of July parade, you don't even know if it was an AR-15. You can't say it's an AR-15. No, I said it was a Smith & Wesson M&P 15, which is yet another AR-15 clone. In fact, I think I used those words exactly. You and your ARs. So, why am I doing this video? Calling an AR-15 a high-powered rifle when it's basically limited to 600 yards, which, to be honest, that's 6 football fields, and ignoring the 30-06 that somebody has for hunting that's got over half a mile of range, effective range with a scope. It's not a high-powered rifle. Listening to the police department lie, bullshit. They could have, it's just an AR-15. You knew it was going to be an AR-15. Let's get that out of the way. It was an unmodified AR-15. It didn't even have a different barrel. It sounded louder because he had probably, this is my guess, it sounded louder either because of the way the audio was being processed badly on some of the videos, or it really was him doing something odd like using a binary trigger, which apparently he didn't, but we haven't been told anything yet. Or he was using hand loads, I don't know. Or the gun might have had a muzzle device, which is commonly available, which some people jokingly call a loudener. It's a compensator to keep the gun's barrel from moving much at all. It actually holds it pretty steady. So you can just keep firing and you'll hit what you're aiming at. Precisely the opposite of what Stephen Paddock did. And, but I don't know. I haven't seen a picture of it. They're not showing a picture of it. They show a picture of the other gun he had, the truck gun as I call it, which is basically a glorified, very long barrel version of a 9mm pistol. It uses 9mm pistol rounds. Maybe it uses plus P, but I doubt it. Shoots it from a rifle-length barrel, so okay, you get some speed improvement. But it's basically, he was going to go to the second location and shoot people with a gun that would have probably left a larger number of them alive per shot, and probably would have got his ass kicked and the thing rammed up his ass that they got a hold of him. But the AR he left on the rooftop, it's just an AR act-alike, and that's it. So someone saying I can't say that it was an AR-15. Yeah, but then again, are you talking about the Colt AR or are you talking about the Armalite? It's a clone AR. I think I said that exactly. Anyway, this has been mostly about the history of firearms and all this coming up as far as changes in technology and needs, and the fact that close quarters and asymmetrical combat became more common after 1900s, and people on horseback charging with a sword drawn sort of stopped happening, so they had to come up with something much more effective at close range than shooting each other with black powder pistols with a speed limit on them, because black powder doesn't work very well. This is addressing people who are looking for any reason at all to contradict what happened because reality bothers them. And some people did point out that, this makes people look bad all over the place every time they contradict things. Again, I do like the fact that people are kind of latching onto the fact that when you lie about something and go look up, it makes you look like an idiot. But thank you very much for your comment, and I had fun looking up the history of ARs and NATO and full 30-06 and that sort of thing. If any of you have any questions or comments, all of these are going to be Wikipedia links below, and I'm not even going to include the comment from the original person because it's just another ignorant comment. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. If you have any criticisms, post them below.